VW capitulates to Tesla in China, and until chip starts coming again in 24, Tesla may end up in a near monopoly position. This is Greg for Teslafaninsight. Thanks once again for joining us. If this is your first time, welcome. A repeat visitor, welcome back. We also want to thank our Patreon supporters and our inexpensive Amazon guitar for helping us to get our show done today. If you enjoy the show, please take time to like and subscribe. And I want to remind those of you who have channels who keep copying us, this is a copyrighted broadcast. Any use of the material presented without permission is prohibited. So I've been having an interesting process over the last 4 or 5 days. Obviously, last week we got the news that Elon really wanted to push for big numbers to finish out the quarter and therefore boost the stock nicely so that all the people who are within the company that own the stock make a lot more money, obviously. What then happened was there are a series of events sort of that happened afterwards. Kathy Woods actually came out. We did a show about how her $3,000 price target for the stock of Tesla. And we did a show about this, hows and whys. And I was kind of surprised at one of her comments that drove the price target, which was she pointed out that there's an issue with Tesla actually gaining market share rather than losing market share as new entrants happen. What was expected to happen is that Tesla, or the marketplace for electric vehicles, would continue to increase, and then Tesla's market share would decrease, but still be going higher because you have a smaller percentage of a bigger market. But what she was talking about is the fact that not only is the marketplace growing, but Tesla is increasing and not decreasing their market share. So the question was, well, why is this and how is all of this working? So I may do a chart depending on how we choose to present this, but there's an interesting math problem that I'd like to have you take a look at that was introduced by the chairman of Ford Europe. The math problem is this: it takes 300 chips to produce an ICE vehicle. It takes 3,000 chips to produce an electric vehicle. So the question mark that comes up is, should you A, use your 3,000 chips in one electric vehicle, or B, use your 3,000 chips in whatever the number may be, let's say 30, let's say 50 or 100 ICE vehicles. And so it's an interesting math problem right now for a lot of ICE manufacturers around the globe, given the shortage of semiconductors. And how that answer to that math problem is currently playing out. So what we're seeing from the major makes right now is that they're actually building vehicles and shipping them near customers. That way, when they do get the semiconductors they need, they can simply install and then deliver those vehicles. That way they can keep some production lines going. It seems that we're entering a new level of issue here, which is you can do this process for a while, but depending on how long it's going to be before those chips get into those vehicles, you could end up going beyond at least one model year, maybe two, before chips are available. And if you have all those vehicles stored out there, there are issues like rust or all these other things that can happen to too much production sitting out there that's finished. So we're now in a very interesting position, which is, how are the manufacturers going to respond to this? Are they going to sacrifice the high-end profitable vehicles, or will they just build fewer EVs that they make very little money on? I believe, as I'm sure you do as well, that what's going to happen is Tesla or the large manufacturers, be it Mercedes-Benz or VW, will elect to identify their highest profit vehicles, usually the larger SUVs, and go ahead and use the chips to go into those vehicles and simply trim or eliminate vehicles that are not making as much money on the low end of the price curve. So this is a very interesting situation. As we reviewed kind of when this whole thing started, one of the problems was that it turns out with semis, you actually have to pay in cash up front before you're given your chips. And so this kind of created a problem for all the OEMs globally last year, because when COVID started coming in, it wasn't clear how long they would be shut down. So it's hard to justify going ahead and paying for these semis in advance if you didn't know if you'd be doing production. So obviously production roared back, and now you have the problem of, hey, we actually sold or gave up our production slots in the line for chips. And so now the problem is that we can't get those back because there are other companies like Tesla that are currently consuming those sold or relinquished spots on the chip production lines last year. So I have to say that I've been a little bit confused here in terms of what was going to happen, and I'm now getting an answer to, what is going to actually occur. And what the confusion focuses on is that I was taught, after casually learning about semiconductor plants, a few different items. The first item is that these factories are really expensive. We're talking at least 2 billion, but we're talking 5 or 10 billion if you have, significant production that's going to go on. I'm told that Taiwan Semi is running the next sort of capital campaign is a $20 billion facility they're building. The second issue that pops up is that a lot of people in that industry tend to have quasi-government relationships. And the reason is that there are a lot of companies that ended up building these factories over the last 30 or 40 years, and all of a sudden they're finished with their factory and the size of the wafer or some other changes occur, causing that factory to potentially have a very short shelf life. And that's why having government affiliation in terms of getting your numbers straight was part of this whole game. And they're willing to do things like this in Korea or Taiwan, or possibly Japan, or yes, a little bit in Japan, but definitely in China. But the governments of those countries are somewhat risking their balance sheets to back up these semiconductor plants because it is inherently risky and there's a large amount of capital that's involved when we go. So, as you know, we've discussed this before, there's a process where if you have a semi factory, people are basically leasing the factory you have to deliver the chips that they've designed. So I was actually told that for a place like Taiwan Semi, Apple actually orders so many chips that they basically rent a whole quarter or a third of a year's worth of production on a line from Taiwan Semi, and they've been sort of buying so many chips that they're moving to the next step of buying machines that would go inside of a Taiwan Semi facility that would only produce Apple chips, because they're getting economies of scale and they're anticipating what their demand might be so that they don't run out in a shortage situation. So I'm bringing up all of this because what I kept being confused about is the fact that you had the auto manufacturers saying, hey, we have a few weeks before we'll be back in production, and the vehicles we've produced, we'll just get the semis and put them inside those vehicles and deliver. Well, that's actually a really good idea, but Robert Bosch talked about the fact that there are some problems in supply chain. And then we got this notice from the chairman of Ford Europe that it's likely 2024 before we see this whole thing cleaned up. So 22, 23, 24. If we do it from now, that's 2.5 years away before the new factories can be built that service enough chips so that these firms can get moving efficiently. So I after I heard this, read this over the weekend, I was thinking to myself, now this makes a lot more sense. Everything's going to be okay. Give us 6 weeks and we'll have our semiconductors and we can put them in the cars and everything's terrific. It was in conflict with the fact that current manufacturing facilities are already stocked with customers demanding those chips. And then it takes 2 years at least to build a new factory if you wanted to deliver new chips to address this issue. So I would say that the truth here is, I believe, more in line with this 2 years away from them getting chip supplies at a regular level. And so now this leaves those companies stuck in that, let's make money on our highest value, make a few of the low end, but in essence, we end up with tight supplies for automobiles around the world and probably for another 2 years. So I was hoping or thinking there might be some miracle they've come up with to acquire the chips in that 3 to 6 month time period. But the problem is that it just isn't there. And you have people like Tesla that are consuming a lot more as they're growing. So what then happened, and why we brought VW into this whole thing, is VW is one of the large manufacturers that are experiencing supply chain issues from the semi standpoint in terms of feeding them into their vehicles. So the next sort of question was, or bit of information that popped up was, the CEO of VW announced that in China they're losing market share. They didn't bother to say who they're losing market share to, but I believe that primarily it's losing market share to Tesla. So what's interesting to me about the circumstance that the folks at VW are in is that VW has started production in Europe, and that's good. The problem that's happening, though, is that when it comes to the Chinese sort of delivery of vehicles, they don't have enough chips to go into those vehicles. So in essence, they've stopped or limited production of electric vehicles, but they're having the same difficulty as other ICE manufacturers. How much do you want to put electric vehicles on the road if you need those chips to go in 30 vehicles rather than one? And so I believe what's going to happen is a lot of those manufacturers are going to end up saying, hey, why don't we just build 30 vehicles instead of one with the chips we do have at the high end? We'll now have enough money to pay Tesla the EV credit fee that we might have to pay them, but it's better for us to pay them than produce one vehicle that's not that very cost or price competitive with what Tesla is doing currently anyway. So I just think this is a potential colossal disaster for VW and the other manufacturers, because one of the things Tesla's doing with the money, obviously, is lowering their prices, making other vehicles not as competitive anyway. So we're, I believe, in an interesting zone, because if it does take 2 years and Tesla's doubling, if not tripling production each year, we could end up in a situation where by the time the domestic makes are ready to go, or domestic or large OEMs are ready to go, Tesla could have such a large footprint in the space that it makes it difficult or impossible for those other entities to really gain any kind of traction. So we kind of end up in that Apple's doing okay, Google's doing okay when it comes to cell phones, but you have a small piece of the market split between a lot of manufacturers that are Me Too. And I believe we're starting to move towards this direction. And if you have these large manufacturing operations globally for these big firms, and their throughput is extremely low, we now end up, I think, in a very bad position where bankruptcy starts to roll in as a possibility, because you just have this money going out the back door to pay Tesla. You have this inability to produce large enough quantities of vehicles rather than just your high end in order to sort of validate the operation of all your manufacturing facilities. Hence, one of the reasons why GM has decided to shut down half of its production domestically already, and it's going to stay buttoned up for an extended period, which they didn't say how long. But I just think it presents an interesting circumstance. And then as you look out and say, well, when do we get back to manufacturing these chips? They're needed. Answers start coming up like there's a factory in Japan that blew up or when it was on fire. We've got COVID impacting shutdowns in Malaysia and other places where the chips should be coming from. So there are a lot of variables that are sneaking in. And all I've got to say is this is the Tesla miracle. It's amazing to see all of these various things that the planet is bringing to bear to help facilitate, the growth and success of Tesla. So I'd have to say, like I said, the biggest shocker for me is the senior sort of big auto companies that indicated that the semi issue is a 6 week to 12 week phenomenon. And I've never seen a semiconductor plant built in 12 weeks in order to relieve this crunch. But in theory, they started manufacturing facilities maybe at the beginning of this year. So in theory, we're a year and a half away from the first chips sort of rolling off that line. So hopefully that's the case. But I wouldn't be surprised if what Ford talked about, this going out a couple of 2.5 years, is a real issue. And if that's the case, I believe you could end up with Tesla in somewhat at a semi-monopoly position, which I believe would be hugely lucrative. So it might be, so what it suggests then is, hey, 3,000 for Tesla is realistic, because when you're heading for monopoly in a critical space like electric vehicles, there's all kinds of government dollars available to help push it globally. And then you have competitors who are not producing enough electric vehicles for good reasons, unable to produce. I just think it's the recipe for unbelievably great numbers from Tesla. And then as you've all seen, the 4680 is coming forward, and for the first time in a long time, we're hearing of Tesla patenting this process to limit the ability of competitors to sort of quickly replicate it and put it into production to compete with them. So it just seems like there's a collection of disaster elements that will definitely bankrupt the weaker players, but could bankrupt some of the bigger players given everything that's going on. So viva Tesla. I think this really sets Tesla up well to do well in this space. And I just have to say, it's terrific to see it happen. And for those of you who are invested heavily, congratulations. I wanted to, prior to going to our health tips, just remind you, please take time to like and subscribe. We have a few SpaceX shares if there's interest. And we also wanted to, and if you are interested, just drop us a private message on our Facebook Teslafaninsight, and with either an email address so that we can send you a note back and initiate some dialogue on what's going on there. So we wanted to move off into our health tips for today. As we've noted in the recent past, we've started doing end of show inclusion of forest bathing methods using ocean video and sound that we might have had, and encourage you to take some time, take some deep breaths, and enjoy what we've presented. We also wanted to note to you that, there are a couple of health tips for the day. The first one is core training. Excellent idea. I wanted to note that there's a professor, his last name is Dinesh, University of Michigan. And it was interesting because he focuses on gout. As you age, the way certain foods will hit you, particularly meats, can be very different and cause big time problems. But it was interesting that his emphasis, even though he's an MD PhD in the gout space, was on leg lifts. What he suggested is doing 25 leg lifts per leg with a 5-pound weight. The reason is it strengthens your knee muscles and allows you to limit the chance of knee issues as you age by strengthening there. And so every day, 25 leg lifts per leg. It was interesting because I met a PA and she actually said to me, well, it's nice you have a 25-pound leg weight, but if you don't, go ahead and do the 25 leg lifts just with the weight of your leg if you don't have the weight handy. And so I wanted to encourage you to consider that as well. You might want to start with that and then go get the weights. They're very inexpensive on Amazon or Walmart or one of those places. So 25 leg lifts a day per leg on a daily basis. Excellent way to go to strengthen those leg muscles. The next thing we wanted to review is prior to lovemaking, don't forget a light salad or something of that ilk was a recommendation made by one of our PAs, because the blood flow to your stomach will limit flow to other extremities that might impact your lovemaking. So another idea to consider. We have a whole list of recommendations below here and would encourage you to take a peek. One other one that I'd like to mention today is just the fact that we actually had a kidney doc in Rockville, Maryland. He made a recommendation that you should have no more than once a week fried foods, because it turns out that your body doesn't know what to do with certain foods like fried foods, whether you use an air fryer or not. And therefore what it tends to do is store those unknown substances next to your large organs, because it doesn't know what to do with them. So limiting how much you're eating of that is a good idea relative to type 2 diabetes. So I just wanted to run these ideas by you today. I think the plot is going to thicken as more manufacturing entities shut down that don't have enough chips. And I wanted to recommend you consider this in your investment process on who to invest in. Chip manufacturers, good idea, NVIDIA and those guys. And we want to thank you for joining us for the day. So our usual exit is Shalom, Salam, Muslim, Lahitro, Hebrew, Chodah, as far as Histrasiche, Russian, Ni Hao Ma, Chinese, Konbanwa, Japanese, Heido, Swedish, our friends in Sweden, good day, our friends in Australia, Tschüss, our friends in Germany, Au revoir, our friends in France, Arrivederci, our friends in Italy, with all that good food that's, fattening. And in Jamaica, we say, enough respect, walk good.